girls, Mrs. B here again with my friend Molly, and this week we're going to be talking about a different theme. Each time we've met, I've had a lesson that has to do with, I've had like one letter that represents most of the words in the title. So the first week was rationing, recycling, and raids, and we talked about blackout raids. The second week was the letter W, women in World War II, lots of W's. The third week was E, entertainment and enjoyment or encouragement during the war. And this week is going to be the letter B, books and birthdays. And we're going to talk about a couple different kinds of books, and we're going to talk about birthdays because Molly here, hi, has a birthday coming up. All the American girls, the historical ones, are given a birthday by the lady that wrote their book, and Molly's is April 22nd, next week. You can have this on April 22nd, the party that we're going to be talking about, or you can have it any day that works out for your family. But I'm going to talk in a little bit about how to celebrate Molly's birthday. And we're going to include food and some games, and it'll be a fun thing you can do for your hands-on or activity at home. Okay? And before I set my friend Molly down, oops, her hat fell off again, her beret. I'm going to show you two things that I've forgotten to show you. She has a locket on here that has a picture of her dad inside. She mentions that in the story. And also, remember I think it was the first week when I was showing you clothes and I showed you a collar with a part of a shirt on it that you could stick under a sweater or some kind of coat, and people wouldn't know that you were not wearing a whole shirt, you were just wearing a part of a shirt, and it was called a dickie. And she has one too. This pretty white collar with the rickrack on it, and you can see it up close, is a dickie. I'm going to pull it out so Molly said that was all right. This is the collar, and here's the front of the shirt. It's not a whole shirt, is it? There's no sleeves, there's no the rest of the shirt, there's just the top part of the shirt, and it would tuck right under her pretty Argyle sweater here, and a lot of people wouldn't know it was wasn't a regular shirt, it was just a dickie. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of even the American Girl dolls, the people that make the clothes and the different items you can buy to go with them, try to keep it somewhat accurate as far as the time and place that the girl lived. Well, that brings us to the American Girl Fair. Before I get into our lesson on books and birthdays, I want to mention two more things about the American Girl Fair. I have talked to you about it. I've written some emails to your parents, and I know some of you have been working already on the project, and that's great. And next week, you'll be sharing a little video of your project. I'll tell your moms and dads or whoever on my email a little bit more about it, but basically you'll just be taking a short video of what you learned and what you did with your doll. Say you were doing Molly. You don't have to have a Molly doll, you don't have to have any of that, but you would talk about 1940s, you would talk about Molly, a little bit about what life would be like for her. Maybe you've done a special project you would show me about her, or some food you made from her time, or some pictures of something you learned. You know, it could be several things, or it could be one thing, whatever you want to do. Some girls may want to talk for 5 minutes or more about their project and show me all the pictures, or show us all the pictures and record it on a video. And some may say, you know, I worked really hard on this one project, and they'll be done talking about it in a minute or two. There's no right or wrong, it's just work on the project and have fun with it. In fact, the two rules I always have are every year for the fair is to learn something and to have fun. And that is so important. And I can tell you from past experience, the girls usually do have fun and do learn. So that's important. One other thing I want to mention that I had forgotten is that if more than one girl wants to do the same American Girl doll, that is okay. That is fine. I already know a couple girls I think are going to do Felicity. If the whole class decided to do Felicity, that would be fine. It doesn't matter if someone else in the class is doing it. You could do as many, it could be as many or as few. It doesn't matter. If every one of you does a different one, if every one of you does one, if 3 of you do Josefina and 2 of you do Samantha and, that kind of thing, that's fine. So don't worry about what anybody else is doing. It does not matter. It's just the one you want to do, the one that interests you the most, that you're going to work on. Okay? If you have any questions, your family can always reach me by email, texting, whatever. Okay. Well, let's get on to our lesson. The first book I want to show you is a cookbook. And the reason we need a cookbook, I'll show you in a little bit. But this is, as you can see, there's our friend Molly again. This is the Molly cookbook. My Molly doll, as I told you, was a dearly loved doll of one of my daughters. And she also wanted the cookbook. And she really enjoyed Molly, so we got some of the extra things for her. The cookbook is important because we've been talking a lot about the time that Molly lived in, and because of that, women had to cook a little differently. Now, we've already touched on this a little bit when we talked about rationing, so I'm not going to go on and on about rationing because you already know that they had to watch what they ate, and a lot of their food was rationed, and they had to be careful. But because of that, the cookbooks of that era, that time, were a little different than the cookbooks of today. The reason is because sometimes the cookbooks had little extra help in them because they knew that milk and butter and cheese and coffee and different things were being rationed, and meats. So they took that into consideration with some of the recipes. They didn't have meals that would be very involved and have a lot of ingredients that would be hard to get. I have a cookbook here that was my mom's in the 40s. She got married in 1943. These are just my notes sticking out of the top. This was given to her for a first anniversary present from her aunt in 1944. Now the cover has come off the book because it's old. And I didn't bring it up here. I have it, but it came off the book and I didn't want to, lose it, so it's downstairs. But let me just tell you that it's red, white, and blue. So many things during the war were red, white, and blue. Like a lot of the clothing that was available, jewelry, and books, and signs, and flags flying places, and things like that, because everybody was involved, as I've told you before, in the war effort. Either they were in the war, fighting in an office, helping people to go to the war, their jobs, the community, everyone was working towards the war. So this book had red and white striped cover, and I believe the writing is blue, and then you can see the binder on the side is blue. This book is a typical cookbook in that it has different divisions as far as, a section with vegetables, dishes, and salads and meats and desserts and stuff like that. But it also has some extra sections in the back that were a little different for their time. And one section is specifically on leftovers, how to use leftovers. And we've already talked earlier about the fact that you didn't throw anything out. And so this section is talking about if you have something left over like carrots from a meal, if they're not cooked yet, you can maybe use them in a salad. If they're cooked, maybe you can throw them in a soup, or maybe you could cook them in a soup or a casserole or whatever. And you can use carrots even in a bread or a cake. There were lots of ways to make do with them and not throw them out, and stretch them, make them last for a couple of days with a couple of meal items instead of just once. One of their lists of the many, they have different categories of different foods for leftovers, and then they'll have several ideas underneath of how to use them. Another one is rice. And I can remember my mom having rice left over from a meal and making rice pudding. I think that was seen more often then. And it was like a custard with eggs and milk, and then you put rice in, mixed it all, and had some cinnamon on top, and you'd bake it in the oven. And that was something that she made on a, not that often, but enough that it was a fairly regular basis that we had. And that's just a good example of, hey, I've got some rice left over, like a cup of rice. I'm not going to throw it away It's not enough for a whole meal, but I could put it in a casserole or something like that, or I could make rice pudding. So that whole section is on trying to save, make the most of what you have. There's another whole section on preserving foods, putting things in the jars or canning them, which we talked about the first week. And so there's a big section in here about how to do that and how, what types of foods you can use and how to do it. And there's also a section in here that, whoops, I lost my page marker, but it's talking about how to cook. And it talks, oh, I can tell you what the title is, but my note, oh, here it is. I was going to say my bookmark fell out, but I found it. Here's a page. It's the headline of this section is Pack a Lunch a Man Can Work On and a Child Can Grow On. And I thought that was kind of interesting because it kind of reflects the times. As I told you before, when women went to work during the war, when women played baseball during the war, a lot of men had trouble with that. Women are women, men are men. Women shouldn't be playing baseball. Women shouldn't be doing men's jobs, that kind of thing. And so there was some problems. And that's because that's the way people believed. The woman's place was usually at home. The dad went out and worked hard for a living, came home. The wife made sure he was fed and helped and taken care of and packed him a lunch every day when he went to work and made sure he was strong so he could work hard for their family, which is important. She also packed a lunch that a child could grow on because she's going to be packing a lunch for kids at school or at home, depending on where they are. And of course, that's important for children to grow strong and healthy. It's just interesting that they don't mention the woman in that section, the wife, the mother, but they're just telling you how you can best be a mom and wife at home by packing those lunches healthy for your family, your husband, and your kids. So anyway, all I'm showing in this is that there's more to it, and it would be interesting to look at, but it does have some good recipes in there. There's one in particular that I still make every year at Thanksgiving. It's a cranberry salad. But as far as cookbooks, I wanted you to know that some of the differences. And I also have a picture in my Molly cookbook of, it's coming, of a cookbook. It's a picture of a cookbook back then. Oops, I thought it was in the front. Well, it's a picture. Here it is. I went right by it. It's a picture of a cookbook, and you can see the lady holding a platter of something. I'm not even sure what it is. They're kind of crescent shaped, whether it's rolls or some recipe she put together. But anyway, the cookbook is called Victory Cookbook. And remember, we also talked about the word victory was also used a lot, just like red, white, and blue. Victory gardens, victory pins, victory everything you can think of, and here's a Victory Cookbook. And it says at the top how to eat well, live well, plan balanced meals under food rationing. So very typical of the time, okay? Well, there's a couple more things I want to point out to you about cooking during that time. And I want to point out to you one thing is the kitchens back then. Now, you all know what your kitchen looks like, but let's think about that. If I had I should have found a really good picture. I did find a picture I'm sending to you that has to do with a kitchen, and things were set up a little bit, and the book Molly shows Molly sitting in a kitchen, and I think has Mrs. Guilford working in the kitchen, so you get a little idea. They had stoves and ovens like we do nowadays, but they were smaller and set up just a little differently. They had refrigerators back then, but they were different than ours. They were relatively new. Just like any new invention, they had come out, I think around the 20s is what I recall. And just like any new invention, the wealthy people could afford them first, and then eventually other families, little by little, got them in their home, and the price became more acceptable. That happened with TVs in later years. It's happened when electricity became available. It took a while, and telephones. It took a while for different places to get those items. Well, people now had stoves and refrigerators. They were a little different too. They were smaller. They were refrigerators, and they were an improvement on what they used to have, which was an ice box with a chunk of ice in it, a block of ice. But now They could open the door and shut it, and they didn't have to keep putting ice in. It ran on its own motor and kept everything cold, and that was great. Now, the motor that ran the thing was originally on top, but by this time it was usually on the bottom, and it was encased. So the bottom half of the refrigerator is mostly motor, the bottom third maybe of the refrigerator. Then the rest was storage. You open your door and there's just a refrigerator. The freezer, some of you nowadays have a freezer that's like the top of the refrigerator, or maybe you have a side-by-side. One side of your refrigerator is a freezer and the other side is a fridge, a refrigerator. They didn't have that back then. They had a freezer inside. You would open your refrigerator door, put your things on the shelves that they had, and then usually at the top there was a box that was a little freezer. And I'm not exaggerating when I show my hands like this, because it was maybe about 12 by 12, a foot wide and a foot long, and maybe a foot deep, about that. My parents used to have an old refrigerator that they'd had before I was born, I believe, and we had it in our basement. It wasn't our regular one, it was like an extra one, but it looked very much like that. The freezer was very small, and it was only big enough for a couple of ice cube trays and maybe some other items or two, but not much of anything. It's nothing like what we have nowadays in our refrigerator freezer combinations. And some of you even have an extra freezer in your home, like maybe in your basement or your garage. You have an extra place that you can store frozen foods. So that's a good thing nowadays. But back then, you didn't have much freezer space. Could they put a lot of frozen food in their freezer? No. So that's why more, if they were saving food, it was canned food. And frozen veggies, even though they were available around that time, you just couldn't keep that many in your home. Or ice cream or things like that. It was just, just think of all the things you keep in your freezer and you'll know what I mean. And I am sending you a picture of a refrigerator with an open door, so you can get a better idea of what they looked like. So we had fridges, just smaller. How about microwave ovens? Do you think they had those back then? No. And you don't have to have a microwave. You can get by without one. But now that we have them, we use them probably a lot. I don't know what your house is like, but we use ours quite a bit. And I know many families that do. So think about that quickness of the microwave brings us, of heating things and warming things up and so forth. And they didn't have it. Another thing that they didn't have is a dishwasher. Washing dishes was a family chore. The kids would help, or help mom or dad, or whoever was doing the dishes. Maybe they took turns. And maybe you do that in your house. But a lot of your dishes, if you have a dishwasher, can go in your dishwasher, right? And I grew up without a dishwasher. I didn't really know a whole lot of difference because I'd never had one before until I grew up and had my own place. And then I got used to one, and I really missed it when two of my daughters had a place that they moved to that didn't have a dishwasher. And for a while, every time we would visit and help out, it was like, oh, we got to do all these dishes. You get used to it. It's not the end of the world. But I'm just giving you this information so you know that the kitchens of back in the 40s were different. They didn't have all the conveniences we had. There was just a lot of different things going on. And as I said, they had to cook according to what was available. A couple things I wanted to mention is when they were watching what they were eating, and I mentioned earlier about making rice pudding and it had eggs in it. I wanted to mention that eggs were one thing that was not rationed. The hens were still producing eggs, the chickens, and they had eggs. And eggs were a very healthy thing for protein back then. You could make boiled eggs, like you might did for Easter and colored them, but just regular everyday eggs you don't have to color. You could make deviled eggs. Have you ever made those? I have a picture of them in my Molly cookbook. As an example of something they enjoyed eating back then. You could make eggs for breakfast. And I think in the Molly books, I think one morning Mom makes eggs for breakfast. There were things you could do to make healthy foods, and eggs were certainly something good to include in your diet. Excuse me, I learned that eggs back then were 51 cents a dozen. And that averages out to about 4 cents an egg. Ask your moms what they pay for their eggs now, because It's gone up quite a bit. Here's some deviled eggs, if you know what I mean. When you cook the egg and you take the center out, the yolk, and you mix it with it's a little mayo and a few things, and you put it back in the center of the egg. And it makes a nice additional part of a meal, just like egg salad or something like that. So eggs could be used in some recipes as well as by themselves. Another thing that had been invented already, and people were able to get it, was Jell-O. But during the war, it became more popular because, here's a picture of a box of Jell-O, because it was so easy to make. I don't know if you've ever made Jell-O, but Jell-O is very easy to make. It's just in a box with a little bag inside that's full of a powder. You get whatever flavor you want. Back in Molly's day, they didn't have as many flavors, like orange and maybe cherry and lime or some lemon, some of the basic ones. But nowadays there's tons of flavors, watermelon, you name it. They have a lot of different flavors. But what I'm saying is during the war it was very easy because all you do is you pour that powder in a bowl, you pour a cup of boiled water in, and you stir it up, and then you add whatever else you need. If you want to make it plain Jell-O, you would just add another cup of cold water and then mix it up and put it in your fridge, and it gets hard and it's like a gel, and you eat it like plain. But back then they usually made a Jell-O where they put something in it. Sometimes fruits, sometimes vegetables, sometimes even they made it into almost like a main dish in a way, or a side salad that was pretty nourishing, and put maybe a little meat and vegetables in it. Now that sounds a little weird to me. When I was growing up, we made Jell-O quite a bit, but we added fruit. We made fruit salads out of it most of the time. There's a picture of a pretty Jell-O salad in the Molly cookbook, and it's a lemon Jell-O, and they put it, mixed it all together, all the ingredients, and then put it on a bed of lettuce to make it look fancy and pretty. And that Jell-O salad it does have a vegetable in it. It has some carrots that are grated, and my mom used to have a recipe with carrots and pineapples, and they really taste good together, like a carrot cake kind of flavor. But anyway, this Jell-O has carrots, apricots, cottage cheese, and the Jell-O, and apricot juice or nectar. And anyway, it's all mixed together, and it turns out pretty good. So just to mention that was something that was cheap and easy to make for a busy mom. And remember, there were a lot of moms that were really basically doing two jobs: taking care of their family, their children, their home, everything that's involved in keeping your family going, and going to work and trying to squeeze sleep into there. So to have something easy to make for dinner was helpful. But you would have been a big help back then if you were living in the 40s, because the older children had to pitch in a lot, and they had to make some of the food. Molly has Mrs. Guilford helping out, and not every family had a Mrs. Guilford. And the older girls especially were making Jell-O and maybe cooking things on top of the stove. And you probably would have learned how to cook a little sooner. I'm not sure, maybe some of you are doing everything by now, but these girls had to learn fast. Now, one more thing, and we'll stop talking about cookbooks. I wanted to mention one thing that I wanted to change that I had told you the first week. When we talked about blackouts, we talked about all the things you would need in the basement or your whatever room you go in for a blackout. And I suggested putting it all in a box, because I said they probably did that, had a box or some kind of container where they kept their candles for light and matches, books to read, card games or whatever they put in there. And I also mentioned that an important item was something to drink, like water, and some food snacks. And I mentioned at the time peanut butter. And I said, I don't think they had that a lot back then. But I did, some more research, and I found out that they sure did have peanut butter, and it was appreciated and enjoyed. Peanut butter had been invented like Jell-O near the end of the 1800s. It just kind of had a surge in popularity. When peanut butter was invented, it was invented by, I believe, a doctor to help elderly people that didn't have many teeth, or maybe no teeth, so they could chew, because they weren't getting enough protein, because they couldn't chew meat because it was too hard to chew, it was too tough. So they weren't eating enough protein, they were just eating all this soft food, and he found a way to grind up peanuts into more of a pasty substance that they could get a source of peanut butter, source of protein in peanut butter. So that was invented, but it took a while to take off. And in the early days, in the early 1900s, like around Samantha's time, it might be considered an elegant food at a fancy restaurant or a fancy luncheon, and it was served with watercress or pimentos in a little square or triangle-shaped sandwich or something fancy. But as time went on, it became more popular with just the everyday people like us. And the soldiers, it was a good source of protein for the soldiers in the war too. Meat didn't keep very long, and that's a protein source. And but it was harder to keep it fresh and able to eat. But peanut butter could last a lot longer, and so they enjoyed that. And they thought it was a little dry though and pasty, so they put some jelly on it that they had received, and that made it taste better. And they enjoyed those PB&Js so much that when they got home from the war, they told their families how much they enjoyed those two together. And I guess from what I read, they helped spread the popularity of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And Molly could have easily had peanut butter sandwiches too. And in fact, there's another recipe in this book that I had totally forgotten about, and because we can never make it at co-op because we can't bring peanuts, right? But she made this recipe is called PB&J roll-ups. And they're sort of like they're pinwheels. You got some bread and you cut off the crusts and you put some peanut butter on them and jelly and roll it up and then slice them. If you're interested, I can send you the recipe. Just have your moms let me know. But anyway, all that to say is peanut butter was there. Peanut butter was also a much cheaper and not rationed form of protein. So you could get a big jar. Back then, their jars were smaller, about a third of this size, I think was the general size, 16 ounces. But Skippy and Peter Pan were the earliest brands that you guys have heard of. And so peanut butter was there. And I read that what a jar of peanut butter back then would have cost, 24 cents for a 16-ounce jar. And again, you can ask your mom how much it costs nowadays. 16 ounces would be about a third. It'd be about up to here on here would be 24 cents. And this is a bigger, more family-sized jar. I have one trivia fact that I'm throwing in. When I was reading about peanut butter, I saw all these things, and I just picked one thing out that was interesting, and I wanted to ask you this, and you can think about it for a second or two. How many peanuts do you think it takes to make a 12-ounce jar? So that'd be even a little bit less. Somewhere around in there amount. Oops, didn't have in front of the camera about this much of peanut butter from there down. How many peanuts do you think it takes to be all crushed and made into a paste and made into peanut butter to make about this much of a little more than it's a cup and a half of peanut butter? You can think about it. You can turn off the tape and then think about it and turn me back on again. But I'm going to tell you that it's 540 peanuts. Just some trivia thing you can tell your friends. All right, enough about peanut butter and food. We're going to move on to a couple other books and to talking about our birthday party. The books that I'm going to tell you about now are not cookbooks, they're school books. In the time of Molly, children went to school. You've been reading about Molly, and you've been reading about her school. The second Molly book is Molly Learns a Lesson. Like all the second books are whatever the girl's name is, learns a lesson. And if they're able to go to school, like Kirsten was, and Samantha, and Molly, and Kit, and some of these ones in the later part of the last 100 years, they had schoolroom, and you've been learning about Molly's classmates and class activities and some of the things that they were involved in. So that's good. You get a good taste of what school was like. And I happen to have a couple of books that I just wanted to show you because they were books that were used in the past to teach school. And just to give you an idea of what Molly would have maybe studied in school. Now, there was a series of books for many years. I believe it came out in the mid-30s, which would be about 10 years before Molly's time, the time that the book was written. Molly was written, it's supposed to be around 1944 or 45. There was a series of books called Alice and Jerry books. Maybe some of the early books had Alice and Jerry in them, but The other ones didn't. They just were a series, the Alice and Jerry books, and they were known to be books for early education, for teaching young kids how to read. And I'm going to show you an example of one that was made. It was written in 1940. It's called Mac and Muff. And in 1940, would have been around the time that Molly was starting school. And so she might have had a book just like this. The book starts with some nice watercolor pictures, and you read, and you have just a couple of words because you meet the characters in the book. This is Nancy and Muff. That's the kitty. She has some yarn she's dangling for the cat to play with, and she's holding her doll. So all the words are Nancy, and then the word and then Muff. And on the page next to it, you meet the boy in the book, and his name is Bob. And here is the dog, and his name is Mac. It's a Scott Terrier, which was actually the same kind of dog that our president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, had. And I mentioned, I think another time, that his name was Fala, F-A-L-A. And many people loved, well, a lot of people loved FDR, the president, and so a lot of people loved his dog, and pictures of his dog, and pins of his dog, and you name it. I don't know if that had anything to do with this book, but that's just a little side fact of what was important and interesting to people back then. So this cute dog is named Mac, and we're going to learn about him as the children were learning to read. So they learn the names of the characters, and they learn the word and, sounding out words. The next couple pages are just pictures. Let's see. I'm trying to show it to you so you can see the sequence. Here's the dog and cat meeting, like seeing each other for the first time. And the cat's kind of arched his back a little bit, which cats do when they're kind of concerned. And pretty soon, the dog takes off Mac after Muff, the cat. In the next picture, the little boy, Bob, is with Nancy, and they're both watching. The cat, or the dog chasing the cat. And then in the last picture, who's chasing who? And you see, the cat is chasing the dog. Muff is chasing Mac. And apparently they're getting to know each other, and because as the book goes on, we learn more about them. And these books were written about families and people in the family and their pets and their parents and their adventures, like with their pets, or maybe having a meal together, or going on a picnic, or playing outside, or just everyday things that families do, but teaching words along the way. In the page after, we just saw a bunch of pictures with no words at all. Now they're going to tell you some words that go with it. Mac sees Muff. Muff sees Mac. They're just explaining exactly what you saw. Now you've already been learning Mac and Muff in the first page. Now you're learning the word sees and sounding it out. Then, it's hard to read backwards. See Mac run. See Muff run. So now we're learning see, and now we're learning the word run. And it's repeated. So you get to practice saying it again. So on each page, they add a word or repeat a word so you can learn. And the next page is Nancy said, see Mac, come Mac, come Mac. Bob said, come Mac, come. Well, we've got said again and come and see, but now we have the word come, and it's repeated. Come Mac, and they both are saying it. And then the next picture, the same with Nancy said, see Muff, come Muff, come Muff. See Mac, run, things like that. So I'm just showing you this to show how children will learn to read, and maybe you learn to read similarly. But this is a book from the 40s, so that's why I wanted you to see it, because that's what Molly would have started probably reading in a book, this book, or something very much like it. And then as time went on, she would go to harder books when there were more stories to them than just come and see. And I know you girls are either you've learned how to read or you're in the process of learning how to read, and so you can relate to that and remember, and maybe a book like that would help you too, but you just get an idea of what they used back then. That's very similar to what I used in school. I did not use the Alice and Jerry series. I used the Dick and Jane series, and maybe your parents have heard of that. This is a book that talks about Dick and Jane and the history of them. It's not an actual textbook. But Dick and Jane was a very similar thing. It was a family with a boy, not named Bob, but a boy named Dick. There he is. And very similar, the pictures were drawn in the, very similarly. It's not the same artist as the Alice and Jerry books, but very similar. And here's a picture of Jane on her tricycle with her dog Spot running after her. And she's holding a doll too. And they had a little sister named Sally. Here's a picture of Sally with the cat. She's helping her mom her mom's vacuuming, and she's using what's called a carpet sweeper. I don't know if you've seen one of those before. And her cat Puff, the family cat, is sitting on the carpet sweeper, and she's smiling, and mom's smiling as she gives Puff a ride. So these are books. The books I had were like a textbook, like a smaller book like this, and I learned how to read by learning about that family. This is what they did together, and then gradually you learn the words for a school book. Now the last thing I want to share with you, I'm going to read you just a little excerpt from another book. This is from the Alice and Jerry series, and this could have been a book that Molly might have read in school. It's closer to her grade. This, I believe, would have been maybe 4th or 5th grade. I can't remember which one it said, but that would be close to where Molly was. And it's a book, again, with pictures of a family and their activities and what they did together. But you can see that there's a lot more words, and you're learning more things. Now the person who wrote this book, her name was Mabel O'Donnell, and as the years went on, she became the main author of the Alice and Jerry books, and she wrote a lot of them. The reason I'm mentioning her is because she grew up in Aurora, and Aurora, I can't remember if any of you, I don't think any of you live in Aurora, but you know we go to North Aurora to the church where we have our co-op, and Aurora is very close to us and to where we live now. And this woman was a teacher, she grew up in Aurora, and then she became a teacher in Aurora and a principal in Aurora, and was involved in helping children learn to read. That sounds like that was her main passion. So not only did she teach, but she wrote books to teach children how to read, and different levels of difficulty so that they could learn and then go up a level and try something a little more challenging. And from what I understand, this was a little more challenging book to go along with the school books that they were already reading. So Molly could have read this. There's also a book that she wrote that I had a teacher read to me in school. My older brothers and sisters used it. I didn't use it as a reading book, but we followed along as our teacher read in it. And her book was called Singing Wheels. And it's about the history of sort of like a Little House on the Prairie book. A little bit like Kirsten, only more like Little House on the Prairie. And it tells about the founding and development of the town of Aurora. She gives it a different name. It's called Hastings Mill, but it's about Aurora. So I think that's just kind of interesting. You don't have to worry about that. But this same lady, Mabel O'Donnell, wrote this book too. And the reason I'm going to read you a little piece in it is because it just gives you an idea of what it was like back then. I think I won't read as much as I plan to because the time flies by so fast, but I'll read you a little bit just to give you an idea now what time was like back then. This is the second chapter of the book, and it's called Jim's Radio. One snowy Sunday afternoon in March, Dick and Nancy, and that's the two main characters in this book, heard the doorbell ring. "I'll see who it is, Mother," said Dick, jumping up from his chair. "If you will, please," said Mother. And no sooner had Dick gone to the door and opened it than a voice said, "Hello, Dick." Dick was surprised and pleased. It was his friend Jim. "Come down to my house as fast as you can," said Jim. "My Uncle Joe is here, and he has brought me a radio for my very own." "Really?" answered Dick. Why, for your very own? I can't believe it." Then Nancy, who could tell by Dick's voice that something exciting was going on, called, "What is it? Is that Jim at the door? What is he talking about?" "A radio!" cried Dick. "Jim's Uncle Joe has brought him a radio for his very own, and he wants me to come down right away to hear it." "May I go too?" asked Nancy. "Ask him if I may go too. I like radios as well as you do." So Dick asked Jim if Nancy might come with him, and Jim said, "Well, yes, of course, but do hurry. I'll be waiting for you." So in another minute, Dick and Nancy were hurrying into their snowsuits and their overshoes, which means their boots, because you have to put boots over your shoes. They put on their mittens and their warm caps, and they ran down the snowy road that Dick and Nancy ran, down the hill as they ran to the house of their friend Jim. And here's a picture of them running down in their snow clothes, their snow suits and hats and mittens and boots or overshoes. The snow was falling and they got wet, and I'm going to skip a little part of this part, and then they're going to get to the house, and when they get there, let's see, they get inside and they rush in, and the mother says, "Wait, take off your boots. Don't forget, you're going to get the house full of snow." And she laughs at them because they're so excited they want to see the radio, they don't even think about taking off their boots. And then they start hearing the radio making noises and making a sound and saying, "This is station HEAR." And this was so exciting that's why they ran in and left their boots on. And they said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we forgot," answered Dick, and he shook the snow off his Nancy and him, and they took off their boots, and then they ran into the room. And there was Jim's father and mother and his Uncle Joe, and there was a little brown box that was their radio, and nobody was saying a word. Everybody was listening to this little box. It looks little in the picture, but I think I told you before, it would have probably been pretty good sized, and it was a radio. And now Jim and Dick and Nancy hardly made a sound as they stepped across the room and sat on the floor, and for a time they sat very still. Soon all three were laughing at the jokes they heard on the radio, but even when they laughed, their eyes were on that little brown box. They were just amazed. Dick and Nancy did not have a radio of their own, and every time they heard one, they thought it was more wonderful than the time before. Of course it was wonderful. Here they were, living far out in the country in Jim's house, because they lived pretty far from town, and at the foot of their own hill, and here they were, and they could hear a cowboy singing a song called "Home, Home on the Range." Maybe you know that one. And it was as plain as if he was right in the room with them. Wow, they just couldn't believe it. And before long, Jim was trying one station after the other. The best thing about this radio was that it belonged to Jim himself. He could try any station he wished, just so that he was very careful. Then Jim let Dick and Nancy try. The radio seemed more wonderful than ever. At sundown, when Dick and Nancy raced back up the long hill, all they could talk about was radio, radio, radio. Well, when they get home, they ended up talking to their parents about the radio and how much money it would cost to have a radio. And they think, "No, we can't afford a radio. It's just too expensive." So it's nice to, to see Jim and see his radio, but that's probably not something we're going to do, basically. But after dinner, they got out their mail order catalog, because they lived far from town, so they rarely went to the store. So they ordered things from a catalog. And the kids get out and they look at the catalog. Here they are looking at the catalog, and they find out that a radio, like the kind they would like to get, would cost $10. And so Dick begins to plan how he can earn money and save up money to buy a radio. And his dad tells him that they're going to need help in the coming weeks because they harvest maple syrup from the maple sap from the trees, like we talked about back in Kirsten's time. And people still make syrup today. And his dad apparently had a forest of maple trees, and every year it was a big job that their family helped out with. And his dad said, "You can be a big help to me and help with the snow, with putting the buckets on and harvesting the syrup, and just like we had talked about before." And so he was going to be earning money for doing that job. And his sister, who wasn't as old, couldn't do the same jobs that he could do, but she was going to be able to earn a little bit of money too. So they worked on that for a long time until they could save enough money to buy a radio. I was just going to see what he said, because he was paying him something like 5 cents an hour for her, and I think it was 10 cents an hour for Dick. So not a lot, but back then that was pretty exciting for a little kid. And you could see by the way I was reading that chapter about their excitement about the radio that it meant a lot to them, and a radio was a big deal. Well, I'm going to finish now and just tell you to make your cupcakes. You don't have to oh, that's one thing I forgot to tell you. I was going to point out that page. I think I didn't say much about that, but I'm going to show you that now. For Molly's birthday, there's a recipe in this book that I'm sending to you, and it's called applesauce cupcakes. And you can make them. Now, in the picture, they show frosting on top. And you don't have to put frosting on top. In fact, when we make them in class, usually we don't. There's a picture of them. I'm going to send this in the email so you know exactly what to put in it. There's not too many unusual ingredients, but there is no sugar. You'll notice that. This is a recipe from that time of the 1940s. The applesauce is sweet, and that gives it some sweetness. And there's also some honey in it and some raisins. And all three of those things are sweeteners, okay? Now you're going to be making that, and I hope that your family will go along with that, and you can make a batch of applesauce muffins, and then you don't have to put frosting on because that would be using butter and sugar, and remember that is part of the thing that they're saving. Anyway, it's a 2-page recipe. So you're going to make that, I hope, and then you'll have a little party for your doll. Maybe you can pretend she's Molly, or just celebrate your own doll and pretend it's her birthday. And then your family can join with you, and you can have a good time. I'm going to send you 2 games that you can play because you're going to have a little birthday party. If you were in the classroom with me and Molly, I would have brought Molly to class, and we would have had our cupcakes at the end after we played a few games together. One of the games is Pin the Tail on the Donkey. You may have heard before, and I'm going to send a copy of that. In case you don't have it or know about it, you can copy it, print it out, and make your own Pin the Tail on the Donkey, where you're blindfolded and you turn around and you try to stick the tail where you think it'll be by feeling. And you see who gets the closest to sticking a tail on a donkey picture that's on the wall. Maybe some of you played it already before. And the other game is called Statues, and I'm going to send you also the instructions for that, so you know how to play that. But you may have played that before. I remember we played it in class, and the girls say, "Oh, I know this one." But it's basically having a sculptor, and one of the people is called a sculptor, and they sculpt each person. I'll send you information so we don't have to take any more time. But it's just a game that was popular at that time. And, of course, both those games can still be played in 2020, the year we're in now. But it's just to give you an idea of what Molly would have had at a birthday party. In the 4th book, I believe it is, of Molly, it's called Happy Birthday, Molly, and you get to learn more about how she celebrated her birthday because it was a little different that year because of a special guest at their home. Well, I will keep in touch with you. Molly and I say goodbye, and if you have any questions, let me know. Bye.